Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast, and thank you for being here with me today. And I'm actually doing something kind of different today that I normally don't do. I'm just recording very spontaneously an episode for the podcast here based upon a letter that I received from a man, and actually I've corresponded back and forth with this man several times by email, and I thought I would just go ahead and do an episode to speak to this man and to his situation. And in view of that, I think I'm going to do something just a little bit different today, and that is that as I do this podcast, I'm going to speak primarily in the first person, which means that I'm basically going to speak directly to this man who wrote me this letter, and the rest of you have permission to essentially eavesdrop on the things that I'm going to be sharing with this man. But you can listen along, and I trust that it will be encouraging and beneficial, and that everyone who hears this episode will get something out of it. And by the way, please know that in my correspondence with this man, he actually gave me permission to speak to his letter on the podcast and requested that I would do so. And in view of that, let me just mention that it's kind of my default mechanism, by the way, that I reserve the option, and I can and I will talk about and reference various notes and letters that I receive as a result of the podcast, and that is unless I'm specifically requested not to do so. And of course, if I ever do that, I will do so with complete anonymity, so nobody knows the person or the letter that I happen to be referencing on the podcast. For example, I would never say, John Smith from Tulsa, Oklahoma, sent me this letter, and here's what this letter says, blah, blah, blah. I won't mention your name. I won't mention where you're from, so it will be completely anonymous. But as letters and notes and questions come in, sometimes I refer to these things on the podcast if I think the situation or the question is noteworthy and could be applicable and helpful to many different people in many different situations. And as I already mentioned, this man sent me this note, and we ended up corresponding. I think that he's written to me a total of 6 different times now through email. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to take the time to read all 6 of his emails, but I am going to read the first 2 because I think that will create enough context for the things that I want to say to him in response. And his dilemma essentially is that he's been married for 3.5 years, and he says that he is not attracted sexually to his wife whatsoever, and he is not able to have sex with his wife. So here's the first note that he sent to me. It says, Hi Tony, please discuss this on the podcast. I'm in a dilemma. My wife and I are married now for 3.5 years. We both waited till marriage for sex. I knew on the wedding night I would never be attracted to my wife. I could go into details, but it's the truth. I did look at porn, but this has not happened in almost a year now after confessing an adulterous relationship to my wife. We are in excellent counseling for 6 months now and working on things. I have now been celibate for 2 months totally, no masturbation either. Please help. What do you do? I opened the marriage package, and I'm highly unattracted to my wife. I'm trying just to retrain my brain to be celibate while still respecting and being faithful, just give up on sex forever. It's her weight, her breasts, her face even. And of course, I keep this to myself to protect her feelings. Please help me. John Smith from Tulsa, Arizona. No, I'm just kidding. That's not his name at all. His name is completely anonymous. And I'm going to go ahead and read the second letter that he wrote to me, because after he wrote the first note, I responded. I shared a couple things with him. I asked him a couple questions, and he wrote back to me, and his second note says this: "Hi, Tony. I greatly appreciate your awesome podcast and ministry. Thanks again. Also, thanks again for being willing to help here a little. I was semi-attracted to my wife physically before marriage. Probably my mistake. I believe I was more attracted to her gentle, mature spirit, and I believe she would be a steadfast, faithful partner who I could rely on and trust, which has proven to be true, very much so. I love her faith and dependability, especially being divorced from someone who was abusive toward me emotionally, which I'm working my way through in counseling. Now, my wife rarely tries to be attractive and doesn't do her makeup unless she's going out. She does this maybe once, perhaps twice a week or so. She works from home. She knows I like her hair down, but most of the time she just pulls it back and ties it, and wears glasses. She looks like a homely woman who doesn't care about her appearance. She's very stressed at work, and her appearance will not change, which is why I'm really working towards sexual abstinence and celibacy. I figure if I wasn't married and I was a single Christian man or woman, I'd still need to be celibate, right? I realize our marriage will be missing out on sex, but if I'm not attracted and aroused, I'm not, right? I can't force attraction. I can't force arousal. The last time we tried having sex, I couldn't even get an erection at all, even on erectile dysfunction meds. I'm not going to do penile injections either for sex. We waited for marriage for sex. So how does one truly know if they're attracted? I did not see her in a bikini or ask her to undress so I could check her out before marriage. When I opened the package on the honeymoon, it was a big letdown. Her breasts are very unattractive. Her figure is very unattractive, and she never gets into sex or knows what to do. This last one is the easiest to overcome. Many times, instead of being attracted to my wife, I'm repulsed. Can a spouse share this with their partner? Of course not. How can you learn to be attracted if you're not? Seems impossible. I even pray that God would miraculously change her into what I'm attracted to. All the Christian experts who promote abstinence before marriage never answer how to deal with this issue at all, right? The only biblical purity answer I can come up with is abstinence, celibacy, and forget about sex, like I'm single. No different than being a single Christian or being in a marriage where the partner can't have sex. Thanks for reading. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this on the podcast. Certainly lots of others deal with this, I assume. So with all that being said in the way of introduction, and now you know this man's situation that he's facing and what he's written to me about, I have thought about this and prayed about it, and so far I have 5 different thoughts that I want to share with this man in response. But before I get to those 5 principles that I want to share, I just want to acknowledge that it's really very hard for me to speak to a situation like this because I'm very confident that there's a lot more that I don't know about the situation than a little bit that I do know. So I'm going to try to speak to it, and I'm going to share these 5 ideas and principles, but I freely admit that I'm speaking to this situation with a very limited point of view and understanding. And the fact is, there's a whole lot more unanswered questions here than there are answered questions in my own heart and mind. And if I had the opportunity, I'd love to ask this man a lot more questions. I'm going to share a few of those questions here in a moment. But basically, said another way, I suspect that there's a whole lot more to this story that we are presently aware of based upon the 2 brief notes that he shared with me. And it's actually for this reason that I was pretty conflicted about even trying to speak to this man's letter in the context of a podcast. in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13, I think the Bible gives us a profound bit of wisdom when it says you should not give an answer before you've heard the entire story. Or another version says you should not give an answer until you've heard both sides of the story. The New Living Translation version of this verse, Proverbs 18:13, says, "Spouting off before listening to the facts is both shameful and foolish." And I'd just say, how many times in your own life have you heard something, and then based upon what you heard, you rush to an opinion or to a judgment, but then later you found out some additional information, or you heard the other person's point of view concerning the situation or the dilemma, and it completely changed your understanding and viewpoint of the situation, and you therefore completely changed your opinion and your judgment of the situation. You see, you made a judgment, or you made a decision, you rendered a verdict before you heard the entire situation. And so I'm trying to speak to this man's question and to his situation with a very, very limited bit of information, and I think that's kind of a risky thing to do. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. I'm just going to share some basic principles or thoughts that this man can think about that I hope will be helpful. But with that being said, I'm quite sure that there's way, way more to the story than we currently know. And as I said a moment ago, if I had the opportunity, I'd love to ask this man about at least 1,000 more questions. And I'll give you just a few as examples. I'd like to ask him, how old is he? What baggage did he bring into his marriage? He mentions that he did not have sex before his marriage, but then later he mentions that he was divorced from a previous marriage. So obviously the man has had sex, but he just didn't have sex with this woman before he married her. So how old are you? What baggage did you bring into the marriage? What's your story? How long were you married to your first wife? Why did you get divorced from your first wife? You mentioned that you had an affair in the context of the second marriage. Did you have an affair? Were you unfaithful in the context of your first marriage? What was the sex like in your first marriage? And what has been your experience with pornography? How old was the first time that you had sex? How old were you the first time you saw pornography? How many women have you had sex with in your life? Have you ever had a homosexual experience? Have you ever been sexually abused in your life? Do you have unrealistic expectations of what your wife should look like? Have you been so saturated and marinated and infiltrated with pornography that you now have a false expectation of what your wife should look like or what sex is supposed to look like? I remember one situation. I was working with this particular couple, and this is a long time ago, but the man had a similar complaint. He said that he was not attracted to his wife. He could not have sex with his wife because of the way she looked physically, and he was turned off. And of course, this was very hurtful to her in the context of the marriage because she felt hurt, she felt rejected, she felt diminished, she felt like she wasn't pretty enough, and all these things. And I'll just tell you guys the truth. I was working with this couple, and then she came in to meet with me. I met with him first, and I was basically kind of shocked when I saw her because I just found her personally to be a very attractive woman. She was maybe a little bit heavy, but not exceptionally heavy. She certainly wasn't obese or anything like that. And so I just didn't know what to expect when this man was telling me he wasn't attracted to his wife. And when I saw her, I thought, holy cow, dude, what kind of standard do you have that you're not attracted to your wife? Because I personally found her to be quite attractive. And also what was ironic is that in my estimation, this man who was not attracted to what I thought was a rather attractive woman, he himself was substantially overweight and not in shape. And so I'm sitting there kind of thinking, holy cow, dude, talk about the pot calling the kettle black. You're not attracted to your wife, but have you ever looked in the mirror recently? Like maybe the old saying goes, people that live in glass houses should not throw rocks. But anyway, with that being said, I can't ask this man any of these kinds of things. He says he's not attracted to his wife. But between you and I, if I had the opportunity, I'd love to see some pictures of his woman. And I'm just curious what she looks like. And I wonder how critical he's being of his wife, and if others would judge her to be as unattractive as he himself is judging her. And then another thing that I would like to ask this man, and in fact I did ask him after he wrote me his first letter, one of the things I asked him basically was, why in the world did you marry this woman? Why would you marry a woman that you were not attracted to? And he says in his letter that they waited to have sex until they got married. He never saw her naked body. He never saw her in a bikini, which, by the way, I think is honorable that they chose to do this thing God's way and they did not have sex before marriage. I think that is the honorable thing to do. And it was the appropriate thing to do. But with that being said, I have to believe that this man still had a pretty accurate sense of what this woman looked like that he chose to marry. He certainly had a sense of her physical appearance. He knew what her face looked like. He knew what her hair looked like. He knew what her teeth looked like. He knew what the shape of her body was. Basically, what kind of shape this woman was in. He probably had a pretty realistic concept of the shape and the size of her breasts and all these kinds of things. And, you know, even if people don't have sex before they get married, if they're in an ongoing relationship, they get to know each other, you have a pretty good sense of who this person is, even physically, and if you're attracted to this person. And he goes on then to answer that question in the second letter, where he basically says that he was semi-attracted to her physically, but probably was making a mistake. He says he believes he was more attracted to her gentle nature and mature spirit, and he believed that she would be a steadfast and faithful partner who he could rely on and trust, which has proven to be true, very much so. So with all that being said, kind of in the way of introduction, it brings me to 5 thoughts that I want to share with this man. And these thoughts aren't necessarily given in any order of priority. They're just 5 different ideas that I'm going to share. And I hope that they might be helpful in some way. So the first principle that I want to share is that I do not think that the solution to your dilemma is to learn to be celibate and to learn to live your entire life within the context of your marriage with no sex. And I think more accurately, the remedy to your dilemma is going to have something to do with you learning to have sex with the wife that God has given to you. And I'll just note that in both of the letters that I read to you, letter 1 and letter 2, you mentioned to me that you're trying to retrain your brain to be celibate and learn to be respectful and faithful to your wife, but just to give up on sex forever. And in your second letter, you say that you're working towards sexual abstinence and celibacy, and you figure that if you weren't married, if you were a single Christian man, then you would have to live without sex, right? So you're just going to try to trick yourself and trick your brain and act like you're not married, even though you really are married. But if you weren't married, you couldn't be having sex. So you're just going to accept that as the standard in the context of your marriage and learn to live without sex. And I just want to say that I do not think that this is a practical solution to your dilemma. In addition, I think it's going to be virtually impossible for you to do. And I'm not sure, but I suspect that this might be part of the reason that you've already had an affair in the context of a short 3.5-year marriage, because apparently you have not been having sex with your wife for 3.5 years, So you became even more vulnerable to having an affair with another woman, which you did. So you might try real hard to live the rest of your life with no sex, even though you're married. You're just going to be celibate and pretend like you're a single Christian man. But if I was a betting man, I'm going to bet that that's going to lead to undue temptation, a high level of temptation, and a vulnerability in your own heart and life, which will make you susceptible to acting out sexually and maybe having another affair or multiple affairs in the years to come. So maybe you'll make it for a year with no sex. Maybe you can make it 2 years or 5 years or maybe even 10 years with no sex and no masturbation. But again, I think it's putting you in a very vulnerable and a very compromised position, and I think there's a good chance that you might act out. And what I'm trying to say here is that I just absolutely think that you are on the wrong rabbit trail here. The solution to your dilemma is to not learn to not have sex. The solution to your dilemma is to learn to have sex with your wife. And by the way, the point I'm trying to make here is exactly what the Corinthians passage says, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1 through 7, which, by the way, I'm going to read here as I continue. But the passage encourages married couples to be available to one another sexually. It says that you should not defraud or withhold yourself sexually from one another, and that if you agree to not have sex, it should be by mutual consent only, and then only for a limited period of time, because sexual abstinence will lead to undue temptation and give the devil an advantage over you. So the Bible very clearly indicates that it's not realistic to try to live for a prolonged period of time with absolutely no sex at all in the context of your marriage. And with that being said, I do want to mention this other scripture. I do acknowledge that Jesus himself said this in Matthew chapter 19. And in the context of the passage, Jesus is actually talking about marriage. And he comes to verse 11 and 12, Matthew 19, and he says that there are 3 different kinds of men who are eunuchs, or who essentially learn to live without sex. Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by other men, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." So Jesus says there's 3 different situations in which a man might come to the place in his life where he lives without sex. Number 1 is a man who is born that way. Let's just say theoretically, and I think this happens, if a man is born, for example, with no penis or some physical disability that's so severe that he literally cannot have sex his entire life. Number 2, he says, some men become eunuchs by other men. So this would be, for example, if you were captured and you were put in prison or made a slave and you had absolutely no sex to a woman for the rest of your life, or you were captured by an evil king, and when this king captures his enemies, he takes all the women as slaves and he castrates all the men and physically disables them in such a way that they are never able to have sex again. That is a eunuch that is forced to be a eunuch by other men. And then number 3, there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. And he goes on to say, those who accept this should accept it. And I think what he's saying there is he's acknowledging that there are very, very few people who would qualify for this third condition, that they would be able to live as eunuchs under a standard that they have imposed upon themselves. And so I'm just saying, dude, I do not think that your chosen remedy, you're going to try to be celibate for the rest of your life and just live without sex and live without masturbation or any expression of your sexual self, I think it's going to be virtually impossible to do, and I don't think that is the remedy to your dilemma. And with that being said, it brings me to the second principle that I want to share, and the second principle is this: love is more than just sex, and true love is based upon much more than a person's body. And of course, I don't know your wife, but I have absolutely no doubt that she's a wonderful, beautiful, awesome person with many admirable traits and qualities, and I have no doubt that this is exactly why you chose to marry this woman. You said yourself in the second letter to me, I believe I was more attracted to her gentle and mature spirit, and I believed that she would be a steadfast, faithful partner who I could rely on and trust, which has proven to be true, very much so. I love her faith and dependability, especially after being divorced from someone who was abusive toward me emotionally, which I'm working through in counseling. So you yourself are acknowledging here that your wife indeed has many beautiful, wonderful qualities. And I guess the point I'm getting to is that I believe that God's design and plan in marriage is that when we make love to our spouse, when we have sex, that I'm basically having sex not just with my wife's body, but I'm having sex with her as a person. Who is her person? What is her personality? What is her sense of humor? What are her admirable traits and qualities? And there's so many things that I love and admire and respect about this woman and this person. So it's not just that you make love to a body, you actually make love to a person. And thus, my second point, love is much more than just sex. And this made me think of, and if I had to choose a proof text here, I would choose 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which is the classic, beautiful, noteworthy passage in the Bible about love. And I think I'm going to go ahead and read it. It's only 13 verses. I don't think I've ever read this chapter on the podcast. So I'm going to read it, but it describes biblically what is love. If you're supposed to love your wife and make love to your wife, what is love? Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 says this: If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all my possessions to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. For love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we all know in part and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, that which is in part will disappear. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And another proof text that I'll choose here, and I'm actually going to talk more about this in our next episode because I see that I'm out of time for today's episode. But Ephesians chapter 5 is the premier chapter in the entire Bible about marriage. And in that chapter, as we know, husbands are exhorted not one time, but 3 different times in the passage. We are told to love our wife in the way that Christ loves the church. So again, the second point that I'm making here is that love is much more than just sex, and true love is based upon much more than a person's body. And just one final comment before I close today. I did a session in the Power of Purity video conference called Love Sex versus Lust Sex. And I think I've talked about this concept in the context of the podcast also. But I basically compare love sex to lust sex. And it's an intriguing comparison if you think about it. And the fact is, I would advocate that so many men, even Christian men, have never really experienced love sex because we have been so saturated and marinated and inundated and infiltrated with pornography and with lust that our sexual self is disoriented and twisted and dysfunctional, and we look at women in a wrong way, we objectify women, and our heart and our sexual self is oriented with lust and infiltrated with lust. And it's interesting because both words start with an L, love, sex, lust, sex. Both have 4 letters, L-O-V-E versus L-U-S-T, but they are 2 radically and diametrically opposed concepts on the way that we can experience love and that we can experience sex. And I might encourage you, if you've never heard it, to go to the website and look up the Power of Purity video conference and watch that little video there, Love Sex versus Lust Sex, if you're interested in this concept. But in short, all I'm saying is that God intends for us to experience love sex with our wife, not lust sex. Or said another way, my attraction to my wife and my turn on with my wife should not just be based upon physical attraction, her physical body and her physical breast and these kinds of things. But if I'm truly loving her the way Ephesians 5 says I should love her as Christ loves the church, and as 1 Corinthians chapter 13 says, maybe I can love her so much as a person that I'm able to love her and enjoy her and cherish her and esteem her and even embrace her and adore her because of love sex. So with that being said, guys, I'm way over time, so I have to wrap up this episode. I said that I have 5 principles that I want to share with you guys in response to this man's letter. And I have now shared the first 2 principles. Number 1 was this: I do not think the solution to your dilemma is to learn to be celibate and to learn to live your entire life without sex. I think the remedy to your dilemma is to learn to have sex with your wife. And number 2, love is more than sex, and true love is based upon much more than the other person's body. And with that being said, guys, I pray today's episode has been a blessing to you and that you have gotten something out of it that would encourage you and speak to your heart and encourage you in your relationship with your wife or your future wife and on your ongoing journey of purity. So with that said, I'm going to say goodbye. Have an awesome week. Have an awesome day. Be blessed in Jesus' name and continue to honor God. Use your no muscle this week. Walk in the light with a brother. Be honest and exercise self-control because you're being filled and empowered by the Holy Spirit. I'll look forward to seeing you guys next week. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.